Silence had fallen over the roadway, an oppressive stillness where chaos had recently reigned. Faint traces of dust lingered in the bitter dawn breeze, drifting slowly across snapped limbs and soil scarred by heavy treads. Somewhere beyond the tree line, an engine coughed, deep and guttural, like the warning growl of a beast before it charges. You could sense the pressure squeezing the air itself, a heavy blanket muffling every sound except that approaching rumble. Then, sliding from behind the veil of pines, the distinct outlines of German armor materialized. Extended cannons, angled plates, a posture of absolute arrogance. They advanced with the swagger of creatures who had never tasted defeat, and why would hesitation exist? Most opposing vehicles crumbled before them. Yet buried within the gloom, motionless and nimble, a different breed of steel waited. Something unforeseen was poised to shatter the morning's routine. It was the early stretch of September, 1944, situated amidst the thick woodlands and undulating fields of eastern France, close to the winding Moselle waterway. The conflict on the continent had evolved into a sprint. After bursting free of the Normandy hedgerows during August, the Allied armies charged across the French countryside, desperate to maintain velocity before the German defensive lines could solidify. Rapidity was the only currency that mattered. The United States military required instruments that could thrust ahead, deliver a crippling blow, and evaporate prior to any reprisal. That specific requirement spawned the M18 Hellcat. The M18 Hellcat defied the typical image a soldier conjured when imagining armored warfare. Its skin was paper-thin, scarcely robust enough to deflect a stray bullet. The fighting compartment yawned open to the sky, leaving the men inside vulnerable to rainfall, shrapnel, and sniper fire. But the deficit in shielding was compensated by a surplus in pure, unbridled velocity. The Hellcat ranked as the swiftest tracked combat vehicle fielded in the entire global struggle, capable of tearing across paved routes at velocities approaching 55 miles each hour. That quickness represented more than a statistic. It defined a core philosophy. The Hellcat wasn't forged to withstand punishment in a duel. It was bred to stalk. The strategic concept underlying American Tank Destroyer Battalions had crystallized long prior to this particular engagement. U.S. Army planning, formulated during the war's initial years, presupposed that hostile panzer divisions would assault in dense, unified waves. To neutralize such a tactic, the Americans cultivated specialized detachments whose purpose was not to bolster foot soldiers like standard tanks, but rather to dash toward breakthroughs and eradicate opposing armor. Mobility reigned supreme above all other considerations. The Hellcat embodied that ideal in its most refined shape. Beneath its sparse exterior, the Hellcat wielded a 76mm cannon, a weapon fully capable of piercing Teutonic plate when applied with skill. But finesse was the operative term. Brute force with the barrel alone wasn't sufficient. The operators were required to adopt a distinct mental framework. They needed to relocate, outflank, dissolve into terrain, and re-emerge from a fresh vector. They were obligated to outwit rather than overpower. Every member of the detachment comprehended that continued existence hinged upon swiftness and tactical placement, never upon the thickness of steel encasing them. Within the German Panzer divisions, the Panther had already cultivated a fearsome legend. Introduced during the previous year, it blended formidable frontal defense, a lethal high-velocity 75mm gun, and surprising maneuverability for its weight class. German crews placed implicit trust in its capabilities. They recognized that in a straightforward exchange of salvos, the Panther would outrange and outlast nearly any vehicle the Western Allies could field. When intelligence briefings mentioned American tank killers, the response was frequently dismissive laughter. Minimal armor, exposed tops, these were not threats to be taken seriously, or so their doctrine insisted. Yet by the autumn of 1944, Fissures were spreading beneath the surface. German formations no longer operated with the cohesive might of earlier campaigns. Scarcity of gasoline was strangling movement. Replacement personnel often lacked the battle-hardened instincts of the veterans they succeeded. Signals intelligence was spotty at best. Still, to the naked eye, a procession of Panthers rumbling down a country lane radiated the same menacing aura as ever. On the morning of September the 19th, components of a German armored procession edged cautiously down a confined artery, flanked by foliage and thick hedges. Experience had taught them that American presence could erupt anywhere, anytime. Despite this wariness, the disposition inside the Panther compartments remained steady, even assured. They had weathered weeks of grueling withdrawal and counterpunch, stalling the Allied tidal wave. A belief persisted that in the realm of armored chess, they still held the superior pieces. They remained oblivious to the fact that a compact unit of U.S. tank destroyers had already infiltrated the vicinity and nestled into firing perches. The 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, operating in conjunction with General Patton's Third Army, had been prosecuting an aggressive campaign across this region. Among their ranks was a platoon of M18 Hellcats, guided by youthful yet seasoned officers who possessed an intimate understanding of their vehicle's constraints and virtues. These were not fresh arrivals, stumbling through their first patrol. A great number had witnessed the frantic surge across France following the St. Lo breakout. They had weathered ambushes by towed anti-tank guns, navigated booby-trapped villages, and endured sudden counterstrokes by desperate German units. They had absorbed hard lessons through direct exposure to fire and steel. By the juncture they neared the Moselle sector, they had ceased merely executing field manuals. They were rewriting the engagement rules in real time. The personnel crewing the Hellcats had internalized a crucial survival tenet. Immobility was synonymous with a grave. Meeting a Panther's frontal glacis head-on was an exercise in futility. Yet they also possessed a contrasting piece of awareness. The Panther harbored vulnerabilities. Its flank protection was noticeably thinner. The rear compartment was susceptible, and amidst the fog of a rapidly shifting engagement, even the mightiest tank could be blindsided. The American lieutenant overseeing the ambuscade, a name recorded in subsequent logs but never elevated to widespread acclaim, had scouted this location with meticulous care. His Hellcats lay concealed upon a gentle swell dominating the path below. The landscape was broken, peppered with clusters of woodland and thick underbrush that shattered their visual profile. From even a modest distance, they dissolved into the environment. He had traversed this stretch before sunrise, inspecting the soil personally, marking where the lane compressed, where the canopy grew densest, and where his vehicles could glide without detection. He grasped that this duel would be determined long before the initial discharge of the cannon. The scheme was elegantly straightforward, albeit fraught with peril. Permit the enemy file to enter the designated trap, withhold fire until the vanguard had drifted past, then savage the midsection and tail, thereby severing any route of withdrawal or tactical maneuvering. The operation demanded absolute synchronization, iron self-control, and the courage to observe hostile barrels drawing closer without flinching. Inside the snug confines of the Hellcats, the men endured the weight. Power plants rumbled at a subdued idle. Marksmen aligned their optics upon the winding track. Assistants cradled armor-piercing rounds, knuckles pale despite the cool air. You can nearly perceive the delicate chime of metal against metal, the subtle vibration of the idle motor, the distant grating of linked treads growing insistent with every heartbeat. Duration seemed to warp and elongate. Each tick of an imaginary clock felt amplified. Every soul crammed within those aluminum hulls recognized that the moment the situation detonated, the pace would become blistering. There would be zero opportunity for rumination, only reflexive action. Then the silhouette of the initial Panther filled the gap entirely. It crept forward, its gun mantlet rotating in a slow, predatory scan. Trailing it came a second, then a third. 9 machines altogether, spaced irregularly along the gravel track, their stark outlines cleaving through the hazy morning illumination. They appeared inexorable, akin to a current of forged steel flowing toward its destination. The junior officer withheld the command. The Panthers lumbered onward, utterly incognizant of the trap yawning around them. They bypassed the first hidden gun carriage, then the second. The American crews suspended respiration. A solitary hasty movement, a shot discharged too early, and the entire elaborate ruse would crumble into a desperate, uncoordinated brawl. When the 4th Panther reached the epicenter of the intended impact zone, the lieutenant at last transmitted the signal. The hush of the forest was violently ruptured. The foremost Hellcat's cannon erupted, its 76mm report tearing a jagged hole in the atmosphere. The projectile hammered into the flank of a Panther, carving a molten path through the side armor. A single breath later, a secondary blast rippled from another Hellcat, striking the engine deck of a separate target. Flames blossomed from the rear louvers, vomiting a thick column of ebony smoke skyward. The German file seized momentarily, paralyzed by a collision of bewilderment and raw alarm. They had anticipated friction, certainly, but not this. Not a strike from concealed defilade, executed with such surgical exactness. And then the Hellcats began their lethal ballet. This defined the element that rendered them so devastating. They refused to remain static and trade shot for shot. The instant their rounds cleared the tube, they were already repositioning, leveraging their mobility to dematerialize before retaliation could be dialed in. One Hellcat surged forward to attain a fresh vantage, while another slipped backward into a depression, only to surface seconds later from an entirely unexpected bearing. The Panthers scrambled to react. Turret drives whined as they traversed toward the fleeting muzzle glimmers. One Panther fired blindly into the thicket, its round shredding foliage but finding only empty air and broken pine branches. Another driver attempted to pivot his hull, striving to align the vehicle's toughest front plate toward the unseen menace. However, the lane was restrictive, and the column had become tightly compressed. The margin for maneuver had evaporated. A third Hellcat discharged, its shell perforating the side armor of yet another Panther. The collision generated a shower of embers and torn steel fragments. The tracked beast shuddered violently, ground to a halt, and began bleeding dense fumes from its fractured shell. Within the German hulls, orders were bellowed, power plants shrieked, and vehicle chiefs fought to reclaim a semblance of order. Yet the circumstance was spiraling beyond their grip. They could not pinpoint a concrete adversary. The fire was originating from multiple headings, swift and unerring. The sensation was one of encirclement by a ghost, an entity too swift to be cornered. The American detachments sustained the intensity of the assault. They functioned as an interlocking mechanism, every Hellcat complementing the actions of the next. One unit would fire, purposely drawing the enemy's optical focus, while a comrade glided into an advantageous firing slot. Their nimbleness permitted them to conduct the tempo of the violence, transforming the Panthers' mass from an asset into an encumbrance. Within the span of a few frantic moments, 3 Panthers had been transformed into stationary pyres. The artery was now congested with wreckage, effectively pinning the point elements and trapping the trailers in a metallic vise. The formation had devolved into a snare of its own making. The lieutenant adjusted his instructions in response to the evolving landscape. He vectored one Hellcat on a wide arc along the perimeter, utilizing a narrow farm track that paralleled the primary route. The operator pushed the throttle hard, the lightweight hull skittering over uneven ground as branches clawed at the flanks. It was a hazardous maneuver, yet it promised a devastating new angle of attack. As the nimble destroyer broke from the scrub onto the German flank, its gunner settled the reticle upon the rear casing of a 4th Panther. The trigger was pulled. The round struck home with undeniable finality, igniting the fuel and ammunition reserves nearly instantaneously. By now, the confidence within the German ranks had curdled into frantic desperation. The premise that these fragile-looking American contraptions were methodically dismantling a column of Panthers was a reality they struggled to accept. The laughter and condescension that had colored earlier reports were now a distant, bitter echo. In their place stood a stark, pressing emergency. One Panther operator finally managed to bring his main armament to bear on a Hellcat that had lingered a fraction of a second too long. The German gun discharged. The projectile impacted the earth mere meters short, kicking up a geyser of soil and pebbles that rattled against the Hellcat's thin skin. The American vehicle snapped into reverse, vanishing behind the protective swell of the ridgeline before a follow-up round could be loaded. The crews understood their precarious reality all too intimately. A single direct impact from a Panther's 75mm gun would be sufficient to obliterate them. Their continued existence was predicated upon uninterrupted motion and 360-degree alertness. Another sharp report cracked from a Hellcat situated slightly above the fray. The shot impacted the turret ring of a Panther, warping the mechanism and locking the gun's traverse. The armored beast was now effectively neutered, unable to bring its weapon to bear. Moments later, a finishing projectile silenced it for good. 5 Panthers had been rendered combat ineffective. The surviving German tanks sought to extract themselves from the kill box. One driver attempted to bull forward, scraping past the smoldering carcass of a comrade. But as the vehicle contorted to squeeze through the gap, its vulnerable side was exposed to the hunters. A waiting Hellcat exploited the opening without mercy, punching a hole just aft of the fighting compartment. The tank convulsed and died. 6. The clash was morphing into something the German tankers had never rehearsed. A meticulously orchestrated slaughter conducted with blistering speed and pinpoint coordination. The auditory landscape was saturated. The bark of high-velocity cannons, the whine of overworked engines, the brittle clang of spalling armor. A thick curtain of smoke coiled through the trees, blending with the pungent odor of incinerated rubber and fuel. You can nearly inhale the acrid tang, sense it coating your throat. The lieutenant remained the calm center of the storm, his eyes sweeping the scene through field lenses, adjusting the disposition of his assets with concise hand gestures and crisp radio chatter. His voice never cracked, even as the chaos reached its zenith. Leadership in such a crucible was less about volume and more about lucidity. A Hellcat shifted its stance once more, utilizing a shallow drainage ditch as a screen. The gunner held fire until a Panther, seeking to reverse away from the inferno, inadvertently offered its rear compartment. He squeezed the trigger. The impact was catastrophic. The vehicle bloomed into an orange rose of flame. 7. The German column had disintegrated into isolated pockets of panic. Communication between individual vehicles had collapsed entirely. Visibility was choked by the expanding pall of smoke and flying debris. Every crew was now waging a private war, fixated solely on its own survival. Some German crewmen began evacuating their crippled mounts, scrambling over the side, and seeking refuge among the roadside ditches. Others remained sealed inside, wrestling with damaged controls or attempting to return fire despite their disorientation. What had once been a proud, coherent column had fragmented into a scattering of helpless, burning giants. The 8th Panther was eliminated shortly thereafter. This kill originated from a Hellcat that had looped around far wider than the German tank commanders had estimated possible. The shot entered from an azimuth they hadn't considered viable. The Panther's side armor, optimized for frontal engagements, offered negligible resistance. 8. Only a solitary Panther remained functional. It sought to retreat, backing along the narrow corridor it had entered. But the jumble of immobilized steel blocked the avenue of escape. The driver attempted to negotiate the wreckage, but the geometry was unforgiving. The tank swiveled slightly, desperately seeking a path to freedom. The final Hellcat eased into its firing slot. The gunner regulated his breathing, steadying the reticle. The range was point blank. The target was unmistakable. He fired. The round penetrated the Panther's rear armor and burrowed deep. For a brief, pregnant pause, there was nothing. Then a jet of fire erupted, chased by a dense, oily plume. The machine ceased all motion. 9. The ambuscade had concluded. The entire violent episode had transpired within a handful of fleeting minutes, but its reverberations would extend far beyond this quiet French lane. 9 Panther battle tanks, machines that had terrorized battlefields from the steppe to the Seine, had been systematically broken by a handful of swift, flimsy-looking tank destroyers. The American crews did not indulge in immediate celebration. They remained vigilant, scanning the tree line and the distant ridges for any sign of a follow-on threat. Only once the all-clear had been established did the tension begin to bleed away, just a fraction. A few men hoisted themselves up from the open turret hatches, surveying the smoldering carnage laid out before them. What they surveyed was a testament to meticulous planning and flawless execution. Scattered Panthers lay inert, their hulks wreathed in black smoke that smudged the pale morning sky. They had achieved what conventional wisdom deemed improbable. Subsequent operational summaries would chronicle the action in sterile, bureaucratic language, noting the efficacy of the ambush, the commendable unit coordination, and the tally of enemy armor destroyed. But those files could never encapsulate the visceral reality of those minutes, the suffocating dread of the wait, the blinding fury of the engagement, the perpetual motion, and the acute understanding that a single error guaranteed a fiery death. This skirmish solidified a reputation. It became a textbook demonstration of the M18 Hellcats' intended role. It was no traditional tank lumbering into the line of fire. It was a predator, leveraging raw velocity, tactical cunning, and the element of surprise. Across the Western theater, comparable insights were being absorbed through blood and fire. Thick armor alone no longer guaranteed dominion. Adaptability, clear communication, and rapid decision-making were ascendant virtues. The Hellcat crews signified an evolution in combat methodology, a pivot toward fluid, dynamic aggression. For the German tankers who managed to slip away from the wreckage, the lesson was stark and unvarnished. The nature of the battlefield had shifted beneath their treads. The opponent they had casually dismissed had demonstrated a frightening capacity for adaptation, exploiting unorthodox methods and turning perceived weaknesses into lethal advantage. You can nearly envision the aftermath. The smoke slowly dissipating, the quiet hiss of cooling metal, the carcasses of the Panthers still radiating heat, and the profound stillness that follows the passing of a great storm. The Hellcats did not loiter. More territory awaited. More fights loomed on the horizon. The war persisted. Yet for that suspended moment on that narrow rural route in eastern France, they had torn up the old rules and written new ones in fire. And somewhere within the collective memory of those who bore witness, the portrait endured. A pack of swift, thinly skinned vehicles striking with surgical precision, then fading into the shadows before the adversary could even grasp the nature of the force that had undone them. The derision that had once accompanied their mention had been supplanted by a quieter, more grudging sentiment. Respect. If you appreciate this style of historical narrative and want to see more stories brought to life, please hit that like button and mention in the comments that Wines of Thought sent you. We read every single one.